The year was 1879, and Clara Whitmore stepped off a dusty stagecoach in Copper Creek, believing she was to be a bride. Instead, she was met with a grave. The man she'd crossed half a country to marry was dead, lone, penniless, and unwanted. Clara felt the world tilt beneath her boots, until a small tug at her skirt stopped her breath. A little girl, wide-eyed and desperate, whispered, "Can you be my mommy?" In that fragile plea lay a choice that would change Clara's fate, and an entire family's future forever. The spring of 1879 had painted the Colorado plains in fragile colors, pale greens pushing through thawing earth, the scent of wet soil clinging to the air. But for Clara Whitmore, the landscape that stretched endlessly beyond the stagecoach window felt more like exile than renewal. She sat rigidly in her seat, gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, the heavy bonnet shadowing her face from curious glances. Every mile carried her farther from everything she had once known, Boston's crowded avenues, the laughter of the girls she had taught in her small classroom, the cramped boarding-house room where she had spent nights dreaming of something more. She had answered the advertisement in desperation, though the ink of her pen had trembled across the page when she wrote, "Young woman of 24, educated, respectable, seeks honorable marriage in the territories." The reply from Mr. Elijah Carter of Copper Creek had been prompt, his words practical and free of embellishment. "I require a wife to keep house and offer companionship. I am 32, a rancher. Life here is plain but steady. Should you accept, I will provide passage and a home." It was hardly a love letter, but Clara had not been seeking romance. She had been seeking belonging. And yet, as the stage jolted over rutted roads and the wilderness grew wilder, a familiar ache twisted inside her. What if she was not wanted after all? What if, when she stepped down onto the dusty street of Copper Creek, Elijah Carter would take one look at her and find her lacking, too plain, too thin, too unnecessary? The stage pulled into the small settlement at midday, the sun sharp and merciless overhead. Clara's eyes scanned the street nervously. Copper Creek was little more than a row of rough-hewn buildings. A saloon with squeaking doors, a blacksmith's forge alive with sparks, a general store, a church with peeling white paint. Children darted barefoot across the street chasing a stray dog, while men in broad hats leaned against posts, their gazes slow and assessing as the stage pulled up in a cloud of dust. "Copper Creek!" the driver barked. Snapping the reins, Clara gathered her bag, heart pounding. The door swung open, and she stepped down, her boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt. She looked for Elijah, remembering his brief description of himself, tall, dark-haired, lean from ranch work. But the faces before her were all strange, and none moved toward her with recognition. Her chest tightened. Had he changed his mind? A tall man in a sweat-stained hat approached at last, but when he removed it, Clara saw the apology written in his gray eyes before he spoke. "Miss Whitmore?" She nodded, her throat too tight to answer. "I'm Sheriff Hale," he said, voice low, careful. "I'm afraid Mr. Carter, he passed 3 weeks ago, caught fever sudden and didn't recover. I'm sorry you weren't told sooner. Word don't travel quick out here." The world seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. The town blurred, the sounds of hammering and shouting fading beneath a rushing in her ears. She had come all this way, spent her last coin, left everything behind, only to find the man she was meant to marry buried beneath Copper Creek's dry earth. She clutched her bag tighter, forcing her voice to remain steady, though it trembled like glass. What am I to do now?" The sheriff's gaze softened with pity, but pity could not mend the hollow space yawning inside her. "Copper Creek is kind enough," he said gently. "We'll find you a place, at least for now." But Clara barely heard him. Her dream of a new life had vanished before it had begun, and yet, as she stood trembling on that dusty street, a tug came at her skirt. She looked down. A little girl, no more than 6, with tangled blonde curls and wide, solemn eyes, gazed up at her. The child's dress was patched, her shoes scuffed, but it was not her appearance that startled Clara. It was her words, whispered so quietly that Clara almost thought she had imagined them. "Can you be my mommy?" Clara's heart clenched. The little girl clung to her skirt with desperate fingers, as though she had been waiting all day just to ask that question. And in that fragile moment, Clara realized she was not as unwanted as she feared. The girl's name was Rose. She would learn soon enough. And Rose had a story of her own, one tangled with loss, loneliness, and a father whose grief had left him silent and distant. A father named Luke Tanner, a widowed rancher whose land stretched beyond the hills and whose little girl had not spoken a word to anyone in months. And so began Clara's story in Copper Creek, not as the bride she had expected to be, but as the woman whose fate shifted the moment a child whispered the question that could change both their lives forever. The spring of 1879 had painted the Colorado plains in fragile colors, pale greens pushing through thawing earth, the scent of wet soil clinging to the air. But for Clara Whitmore, the landscape that stretched endlessly beyond the stagecoach window felt more like exile than renewal. She sat rigidly in her seat, gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, the heavy bonnet shadowing her face from curious glances. Every mile carried her farther from everything she had once known, Boston's crowded avenues, the laughter of the girls she had taught in her small classroom, the cramped boarding-house room where she had spent nights dreaming of something more. She had answered the advertisement in desperation, though the ink of her pen had trembled across the page when she wrote, "Young woman of 24, educated, respectable, seeks honorable marriage in the territories." The reply from Mr. Elijah Carter of Copper Creek had been prompt, his words practical and free of embellishment. "I require a wife to keep house and offer companionship. I am 32, a rancher. Life here is plain but steady. Should you accept, I will provide passage and a home." It was hardly a love letter, but Clara had not been seeking romance. She had been seeking belonging. And yet, as the stage jolted over rutted roads and the wilderness grew wilder, a familiar ache twisted inside her. What if she was not wanted after all? What if, when she stepped down onto the dusty street of Copper Creek, Elijah Carter would take one look at her and find her lacking, too plain, too thin, too unnecessary? The stage pulled into the small settlement at midday, the sun sharp and merciless overhead. Clara's eyes scanned the street nervously. Copper Creek was little more than a row of rough-hewn buildings, a saloon with squeaking doors, a blacksmith's forge alive with sparks, a general store, a church with peeling white paint. Children darted barefoot across the street chasing a stray dog, while men in broad hats leaned against posts, their gazes slow and assessing as the stage pulled up in a cloud of dust. "Copper Creek!" the driver barked, snapping the reins. Clara gathered her bag, heart pounding. The door swung open, and she stepped down, her boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt. She looked for Elijah, remembering his brief description of himself, tall, dark-haired, lean from ranch work. But the faces before her were all strange, and none moved toward her with recognition. Her chest tightened. Had he changed his mind? A tall man in a sweat-stained hat approached at last, but when he removed it, Clara saw the apology written in his gray eyes before he spoke. "Miss Whitmore?" She nodded, her throat too tight to answer. "I'm Sheriff Hale," he said, voice low, careful. "I'm afraid Mr. Carter. He passed 3 weeks ago. Caught fever sudden and didn't recover. I'm sorry you weren't told sooner. Word don't travel quick out here." The world seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. The town blurred, the sounds of hammering and shouting fading beneath a rushing in her ears. She had come all this way, spent her last coin, left everything behind, only to find the man she was meant to marry buried beneath Copper Creek's dry earth. She clutched her bag tighter, forcing her voice to remain steady, though it trembled like glass. What am I to do now?" The sheriff's gaze softened with pity, but pity could not mend the hollow space yawning inside her. "Copper Creek is kind enough," he said gently. "We'll find you a place, at least for now." But Clara barely heard him. Her dream of a new life had vanished before it had begun. And yet, as she stood trembling on that dusty street, a tug came at her skirt. She looked down. A little girl, no more than 6, with tangled blonde curls and wide, solemn eyes, gazed up at her. The child's dress was patched, her shoes scuffed, but it was not her appearance that startled Clara. It was her words, whispered so quietly that Clara almost thought she had imagined them. "Can you be my mommy?" Clara's heart clenched. The little girl clung to her skirt with desperate fingers, as though she had been waiting all day just to ask that question. And in that fragile moment, Clara realized she was not as unwanted as she feared. The girl's name was Rose, she would learn soon enough. And Rose had a story of her own, one tangled with loss, loneliness, and a father whose grief had left him silent and distant. A father named Luke Tanner, a widowed rancher whose land stretched beyond the hills and whose little girl had not spoken a word to anyone in months. And so began Clara's story in Copper Creek. Not as the bride she had expected to be, but as the woman whose fate shifted the moment a child whispered the question that could change both their lives forever. Clara lowered to her knees, so her face was level with the little girl's. The town spun behind them, men calling to one another, the clang of a hammer, the rattle of the stage's harnesses, but in the circle of dust where the child clutched her skirt there was only the steady sound of Rose's breathing and the fragile hope trembling in the child's eyes. Clara had imagined 100 things that might happen when she arrived in Copper Creek, but not this. Not a small hand reaching for her like a lifeline. "Rose," Sheriff Hale said softly, moving closer. "Honey, where's your pa?" The girl didn't answer the sheriff. She kept those solemn eyes on Clara. "You look like you'd smell nice," she whispered, as if testing a secret. "Like soap in a book." Then she glanced over her shoulder, a hesitation flitting across her face like a shadow. "Please, can you be my mommy?" Clara's throat tightened. Rose." The voice came from the porch of the general store, a man's voice, worn by wind and grief. He stood half in shadow, tall and straight, despite the slump of fatigue in his shoulders. His hat brim cut a line across his brow, but as he stepped down into the sunlight, Clara saw the rest of him. Dark hair, rough beard, eyes the color of river stones. He carried himself like someone who had done more work than any one man should, and who had kept doing it because there was no one else to do it. The little girl's fingers spasmed against Clara's skirt. She didn't let go. "Luke," Sheriff Hale said with a nod that carried apology, "you know Miss Whitmore's business got upended." Rose found her. The man, Luke Tanner, halted a few paces away, gaze flicking from the child to Clara and back. His face was careful, like a door propped closed with a chair. "Rose," he said again, more quietly now. "Come on, bug." Rose shook her head. She pressed closer, and Clara felt the tremble of that small body. The instinct surprised her with its certainty. Clara's hand lifted of its own accord and smoothed a stray curl from Rose's forehead. "Hello, Rose," she said softly. "I'm Clara." Rose nodded as if that answered everything. Tanner removed his hat. "Miss Whitmore," he said, voice steady but raw at the edges. "I'm sorry about your loss. I can't speak to asking a stranger that kind of thing." His eye moved to his daughter. "Rose is 6. Her ma died in the winter before last. She doesn't—" He stopped, jaw tightening, as if the words hurt to push through. "She hasn't spoken much since." Sheriff Hale scraped his boot in the dirt. "Won't say more'n a word to anyone," he added softly. "And then only once in a while." Clara looked at the child again. Rose was watching her like a sparrow that had flown inside and couldn't find the window back out. "She spoke to me," Clara said, surprised to hear her own voice shaking. She asked a question. "Children ask things they don't fully understand," Tanner replied, gentle but firm. "Bug, we'll get in the way. Let's go." But Rose shook her head and moved behind Clara's skirt as if it were a gate. She peeked around the fabric and whispered, "I dreamed you were coming." Tanner flinched. No one else might have seen it, but Clara did, as if the words had struck him somewhere he'd kept armored for too long. "Miss Whitmore," Sheriff Hale said quickly, attempting to untangle the sudden, tender mess of it. "We'll see you to the boarding house. Mrs. Perks runs it clean. We'll sort things by afternoon." Clara nodded, though the nod felt like something tiny compared with the ache spilling through her ribs. "Of course." She lifted her bag. Rose reached for it too, tiny fingers clutching the worn leather handle, and together, woman and child, they crossed Copper Creek's main street toward the boarding house porch, Sheriff Hale at their side, Luke Tanner following at a wary distance like a man trailing behind his own fate. Mrs. Perks had a voice like swinging pans. "You poor mite," she clucked the instant she saw Clara. Come in, put that bag down. Mercy, Sheriff Hale, you bring me every stray in this county." She paused only long enough to look from Clara to the little girl pressed to her hip. "Luke Tanner, if that child's trailed this lady here like a duckling, you could at least say hello proper." Tanner cleared his throat. "Afternoon, Mrs. Perks." She said, with a look that said she knew the clothes in his drawers were probably folded poorly and that he was the one who'd done it. "Well, I've got one room open. It's small, but clean. Supper is stew and cornbread. Tea if you want it. Coffee if you need it. That will be 25 cents the night." Clara reached for the reticule tucked at her corset and felt the thinness of its contents like a bruise. "Thank you," she said, and passed over coins that had been meant to begin a new life and would now only hold back the edges of the old one. The sheriff tipped his hat. "I'll send word to the Carter place," he told her quietly. "Maybe there's a trunk or two with your name on it if Elijah paid freight." When he was gone, Mrs. Perks gave Clara a long, measuring look that softened at the corners. "I'll set you in back where it's quiet," she said. "You look like you haven't slept since New York." "Boston," Clara corrected faintly. "Longer than New York, then," Mrs. Perks replied, and ushered them up the narrow stairs. Rose did not let go of Clara's hand until they reached the small room beneath the eaves. The bed was neatly made, the quilt sun-faded but sturdy. A washbowl gleamed on the dresser, and a single window looked out over the alley and a sliver of hills beyond the livery roof. "This will do fine," Clara said, and meant it. It was not what she had imagined, but it was a small square of space that was hers to breathe inside. Rose slipped past her, climbed onto the bed on her knees, and put her ear to the pillow, as if listening for a seashell's whisper. "It's quiet," the child said. "Some folks might call that lonely," Mrs. Perks said briskly, then winked at Clara in a way that made the word hurt less. "Supper at 6. They were alone. Clara set her bag on the chair. When she turned back, the little girl was watching her with the expectant hope of a soul waiting for a verdict. "I can't be your mother," Clara whispered, before the child could ask again. It felt cruel to say, but crueler not to. "But I can be your friend," Rose blinked. "Do friends brush hair?" "They do," Clara answered. "They brush it and braid it, if asked." The child's small shoulders dropped, and a bit of air went out of both their chests. "All right," Rose whispered. "Friend." "Friend," Clara repeated. She reached for the brush in her bag, and with careful strokes began to untangle curls the color of wheat in late sun. The first knot loosened, then another. The world outside the window went on clanging and shouting and stomping, but in that small room 2 people held very still and found out how to belong to the same quiet. Luke Tanner did not sleep that night. When the cattle were watered and the tack checked and the gate chain tested twice by habit, He sat on the porch with his boots on the top step and watched the long black sweep of prairie draw a line against the stars. The Tanner place had been his father's, and his father's before that, deed scrawled with a hand that knew plows better than pens, but it had never felt so empty as it did since Martha died. He had patched things after, hammered slats back where grief had ripped them out. But the wind found its way in no matter how he tried to nail the house tight. Rose had slept in his shirt last night, the blue cotton one she liked because it smelled like the corral. She curled small in her bed, fists near her face, her lashes stick straight on skin that was thinner than any 6-year-old's ought to be. When the nightmares came, he got there before the scream fully formed and carried her to the rocker and kept his mouth shut, because any noise might shatter something you couldn't glue back. Martha had been all laughter. Martha had been wind in a wheat field. Martha had been morning light. The day the fever took her, Luke had been 2 hours hauling hay south and came back to a house already half cool. Grief made him a worse father than he intended. He forgot things. He remembered the wrong ones. He worried that what had broken in him would leak down into his daughter and turn her brittle too. This afternoon Rose had spoken to a stranger. Of all the things Luke had imagined and feared, that was not among them. He could still hear the small, steady tone of Rose's voice. "Can you be my mommy?" The words made something in his chest ache and twitch, like a muscle that hadn't been used in a long time. He scrubbed a hand over his jaw. The stars made 1,000 small holes in the night. He tried to picture the stranger from Boston. Miss Whitmore had stood there with the dust on her shoes and the stubborn set of someone who'd run out of road and somehow found another just the same. She had not flinched when Rose clung to her. She had not made false promises. She had not chided or pooh-poohed or melted. She just knelt down and said hello like it was a sacred ceremony. He felt both grateful and nettled by that. Grateful because Rose had smiled, just barely, and nettled because strangers had a way of lifting a weight for a moment that you would then have to carry twice as long. A night bird called. Luke leaned back until the chair's back legs balanced on the worn edge of the board. He reminded himself that tomorrow was another day, which meant fences didn't mend themselves and cattle didn't feed themselves, and whatever ache a man carried would not keep the creek from freezing when it wanted to, or the heat from settling in his collar when it could. The world expected a certain amount of work and got it, or else it took more than you could afford. He would go to town in the morning. He would thank Miss Whitmore for her kindness, and he would tell Rose Plain that friends were not mothers, and that wishes were not bridges a person could just walk over. And if he sounded too hard when he said it, he would bear that too. He had learned to bear a lot. Clara woke before dawn to the smell of coffee, the sounds of old boards stretching their joints, and the strange new certainty that she had stepped into a life that had no place for her, and yet somehow still expected her to get up and make the bed. She washed quickly in the cool water, braided her hair, and was halfway down the stairs when she found Rose sitting on the bottom step, a small bundle of shawl and sandals. "Are you waiting to go somewhere?" Clara asked. Rose nodded. "To school," she said cautiously, as if testing whether the word would break in her mouth. "Do you go every day?" The child thought, "Sometimes." She looked toward the door. "Mrs. Parker says I'm quiet as a mouse, and she likes mice only if they read." Clara swallowed a smile. "Mrs. Parker sounds like a very sensible woman. Are you coming?" Clara hesitated. The truth was, she had nowhere else to be. A day without tasks felt like sliding on ice. One wrong move and you were on your back. "I'd be honored," she said, and Rose's hand found hers without looking, as if it knew the way. They paused at the boarding-house kitchen long enough for Mrs. Perks to load a tin pail with 2 buttered biscuits and a slice of leftover cornbread. "You look like you could eat kindness and still be hungry," she told Clara, thumping the lid on. Then woman and child stepped into the street where Copper Creek was rubbing sleep from its eyes. A black-haired boy shot past trailing a limping pup. "Come on, River," he yelled. "School's only bad if you got to learn." The dog barreled sideways after him, yipping like a question mark. Rose watched them go, her mouth tipping up just a little, and that was how Luke Tanner found the two of them when he crossed from the livery, hat in his hands. "Morning." His eyes found Rose first and softened. "You heading to school, Bug?" Rose nodded. "Good." He looked at Clara next. "Miss Whitmore." "Mr. Tanner." He rocked briefly on his heels, hat turning slowly between his fingers. "Thank you for yesterday," he said. "I mean it." "You're welcome." The pleats of her skirt felt too carefully arranged. She wished she'd worn something she could ruin without worrying about it. "Rose and I were just on our way to the schoolhouse." "Good." He repeated himself as if words were tinder that didn't catch easily. "I'll pick her up at noon, or Mrs. Parker will send them out like usual." Rose's hand tightened. "Can Miss Clara pick me up?" she asked, the words barely a breath. Luke's jaw shifted. He looked at his daughter for a long second, then at Clara. "If it's not too much trouble." "It isn't," Clara said softly. She felt again that invisible weight settle across the space between them, gratitude, and the carefulness around it. He touched his hat brim, a half gesture of farewell, and turned to go. Rose watched him take 3, 4, 5 steps. "Papa," she called, so softly that only Clara heard it. He turned back immediately, and Rose just looked at him for a beat, like she was memorizing him, before she nodded and tucked her hand deeper into Clara's. Luke's face folded in on itself for a heartbeat. Relief, sorrow, something else. And then he went. The schoolhouse welcomed them with chalk dust and the smell of old wood warmed by sun. Mrs. Parker was a woman with salt in her hair and a smile that could turn a bad day toward good merely by refusing to admit it was bad to begin with. She took one look at Clara and sent her a nod that felt like a rope thrown from a boat. "Come in, stranger," she said cheerfully. "I was just thinking I needed an extra pair of hands." Children have a way of outnumbering grown folks. By 10 o'clock, Clara had wrapped 6 readers in brown paper to keep the covers from falling off, split 3 quills, mended a slate frame with twine and a broken shoelace, and showed a boy named Eli how to keep his letters from wrestling each other on the line. By 11, she had wholly forgotten that she did not belong. She stood at the back of the room with her skirts tucked around her boots and listened to Rose haltingly sound out cat and track and creek, the words picking their way across the page like careful feet crossing a stream. When the bell released them, children spilled into the yard, shouting, tossing the morning off like coats. Rose stayed close. She and Clara shared Mrs. Perks's biscuits on the steps, crumbs catching in Rose's hair like tiny stars. At noon, Luke appeared. He was dusted with road and looked like he'd won a fight with something stubborn and still wasn't sure if he'd taken too much skin off his knuckles in the winning. "How'd she do?" he asked, eyes on Rose. "Bravely," Clara said, "which is the root of most good learning." He made a small sound in his throat that might have been agreement. "You hungry, Bug?" Rose nodded. She stood and set her little jaw in that way she did when braver than her bones, then stretched up on her toes and wrapped her arms around Clara's waist. It surprised both of them. That hug, quick, warm, sure. And before Clara could return it, the girl had stepped away and put her hand in her father's. Luke swallowed, the motion visible in his throat. He tipped his hat. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore." "Clara?" she said, surprising herself. He hesitated. "Luke?" he returned. Then he led his daughter down the steps and out into the bright, thin noon, where everything was too sharp to look at directly, and the dust looked like it might be made of old gold ground to powder. Word fluttered through Copper Creek that afternoon like laundry on 10 different lines. The Boston girl who came to marry a dead man, the Tanner child who had not spoken, the way the two of them moved through the schoolyard like a story people had not expected to hear, and now could not stop telling. By evening, women arrived at the boarding-house door with small offerings, a jar of blackberry jam, a pair of serviceable stockings, a book with a broken spine and a missing chapter, as if to say, "We see you. We don't know what to do with you yet, but we see you." Clara sat at the edge of her narrow bed and carefully wrote thank-you notes in a hand that looked steadier than her heart felt. She folded them and set them in a neat stack and told herself she was not crying. The wind tugged at the curtain. The smell of horses drifted in. Below, Mrs. Perks sang to a kettle as if it were a child, all clatter and sweetness. A soft knock at her door broke the spell. "Come in," Clara called, hastily blotting the last note. The door creaked. Sheriff Hale stepped into the room with the carefulness of a man entering a church. He held his hat against his chest. "Evening, Miss Whitmore." "Sheriff," Clara said, standing. "Is something wrong?" He shook his head. "Nothing a plate of stew won't fix," he said, then sobered. "I wanted to apologize that you weren't told about Elijah. I sent a wire. I did. But the line's a gossip, and sometimes it doesn't pass secrets along, less it likes 'em." She managed a smile. "Thank you for trying." He cleared his throat. "I also wanted to say, folk here can be slow to change their minds, but not stingy with their hearts once they've made 'em up." He glanced at the neat stack of notes. "You've the makings of a schoolteacher's calm, Miss Whitmore. And the Tanner girls, folks care about that child. Care about Luke, too, though he don't always let 'em." Clara looked out the window at a square of purpled sky. "Grief makes people quiet," she said. "Sometimes it makes them loud. Mostly it makes them clumsy." Hale huffed a small laugh. "That it does." He shifted, embarrassed by the way conversation had wandered into weeds. "Anyhow, you've got friends here, even if they haven't introduced themselves yet." "Thank you," Clara said again, and meant it more because the words fit better now. After he left, she went down to supper and ate more than she had in a week. When she went back up, she paused at the window and looked toward the dark slope of land where she imagined the Tanner ranch might be. The prairie had a way of making distances into guesses. She pressed her palm to the glass as if she could send steadiness northward. "Sleep well, little mouse," she whispered. She did not expect an answer. She imagined, just for a second, that she got one anyway. The next morning brought wind, the kind that got under your coat and learned your middle name. Clara wrapped her shawl tight and made for the store. The boarding-house room was already neat to a fault, and there was only so much gratitude a person could write before the ink dried up. The general store felt like a place where ordinary life happened. Lists, shelves, baskets of nails, the smell of molasses. She thought if she stood near that much order, some of it might climb into her pocket and come away with her. She was reaching for a spool of thread she did not particularly need when a voice said, "You dropping anchor here, Miss Whitmore, or just floating a while?" She turned. The man behind the counter wore a vest and a look of amiable nosiness. His name, careful letters over the door said, was David Pritchard. "I suppose that depends on the current," Clara answered. He grinned. "We could use more folks who know their letters. Mrs. Parker's been saying so since the spring thaw." He lifted his chin toward the window where the schoolhouse stood a block away. "She'd tell you herself, but there's a swarm on her today, and she's got both hands full of bees." "I was there yesterday," Clara said. "I helped a bit." "I heard." He nodded, exactly as if he'd known everything there was to know since sunrise, and was simply confirming the flavor of the rumor. Luke said, come sunset, Rose told him she wanted a story about a girl who walked all the way from Boston inside a letter. Clara blinked. "She spoke at home?" "Word is 3 words," he said, counting on his fingers. "Read it, Papa." Her heart knocked against her ribs. The store blurred faintly, and she realized she had not taken a proper breath in a handful of seconds. She reached for the counter, steadied herself with the feel of wood worn satin smooth by years of hands. "You all right?" Pritchard asked, all nosiness gone from his face now. "Yes," she said, and found that the yes was true. More than. He slid a jar of barley sugar across the counter like a magician revealing a dove. "For teachers and other saints," he said, with mock gravity, "on the house." She laughed, and it startled both of them. "Thank you," she said, and tucked the jar in her bag. When she stepped back into the wind, she closed her eyes for a second and leaned into it. She'd been bracing against every breath this place took. Perhaps it was time to let it push her a little and see where she ended up. 3 days later, a boy fell from a mule. He was 10, red-headed, furious, and the kind of child who climbed anything that sat still long enough to insult him by not moving. The mule's name was Diggory, and Diggory had a temper from birth and a grudge against gravity, which did not stop Eli from standing on his back in the corral to show the others he could. When the animal shrugged him off, he landed hard on the packed dirt. The sound his arm made when it broke was the sound of a door kicked inward. There was no doctor in Copper Creek. The nearest one lived 2 towns away and took his time unless someone was dying spectacularly, and even then he might be at dinner. Folks did what folks had done since the first cabin was built: set bones as best they could, stitched with needles better suited for sacks than skin, prayed. But a child's arm was like a sapling: set it crooked, and the tree grew wrong. Clara was brushing Rose's hair on the boarding house porch when the Hollis girl ran up, breath coming like tiny fists. "Eli fell. He's hollering like a cat in a water barrel." Mrs. Parker said, "Fetch you." "I'm not a—" Clara began, but the girl was already halfway back down the walk. Rose looked up at Clara with a calmness that went to marrow. "You're good at fixing," she said. Clara's father had been a wharf carpenter, and when he died she learned that hearts cracked just like pilings. Somewhere along the line, she'd learned to make broken things hold fast. "We'll try," she said, and stood. The schoolyard had become a small storm. Eli writhed on the ground, white-faced and sweating, his arm already swelling strange, and a woman knelt beside him with the precise steadiness of someone refusing to panic. "I sent someone for Luke," she told Clara tightly. "He's got the strongest hands for holding, and he won't let go. If the bone's to be set, we'll need him." Clara looked at the child and at the arm slanting wrong beneath his sleeve. She looked at the cluster of younger ones, wide-eyed and eating fear with their mouths open. She looked at Rose, who had come as far as the fence, and stopped, hands gripping the rail as if it could keep the world from breaking further. When Luke arrived at a run, he didn't speak. He went to his knees in the dust opposite Clara, slid his hands under the boy's shoulders, and met her eyes. There was no question there, no judgment, only a simple transfer of trust. He braced. She moved. "Eli," Clara said steadily, "I'm going to make this straight. It will hurt. You can swear if you must, but you may not bite me. Agreed?" The boy gulped and nodded, tears slicking the red of his lashes. "Do it," he hissed. Luke held. Clara pulled. There was a moment, one heartbeat only, when the world hung on the clean line of bone moving toward the right place. Then it slid with a soft, wet click into alignment. Eli screamed once, the kind of sound that ripped the dust out of the air. Then he went limp. "Fine, son," Luke said roughly, breath ragged. "You're fine." Clara wrapped the arm with a splint cut from a crate and bandage strips torn from Mrs. Parker's spare petticoat. When it was done, she sat back and realized she was shaking. Luke took one look at her and found gravity again. He folded his long legs beneath him and pressed his forearms to his thighs like a man who had used every muscle he had and didn't mind saying so. Eli blinked up at the sky. "I stood on a mule," he whispered. "Seems so," Luke said. "Don't tell my ma." "We'll have to." Eli closed his eyes. "She'll say the mule was smarter." "She won't be wrong," Luke replied. Laughter lifted at the edges of the yard like a tent suddenly finding its poles. Children breathed again. Mrs. Parker wiped her eyes. Rose unclenched her small hands from the fence and stepped closer. Clara became aware of Luke's gaze. Not hot, not heavy, just there, like the sun when you come out from a barn. That was good work, he said quietly. She swallowed. I've set my share of broken things, he nodded. So have I. Their eyes held for a second longer than the moment strictly needed. Then he bent, scooped Eli up with an ease that made the boy's jaw sag, and then tighten with pride, and carried him toward his mother's house without grunting once to prove it was nothing. Clara exhaled. The wind had hardened into afternoon. She smoothed her skirt and found Rose's hand as if she hadn't known all along where it was. See, Rose said, with the solemn satisfaction of a foregone conclusion. Fixing. After that, Copper Creek began to lean into Clara as if she were a fence post that held the wire taut. She didn't go knocking on doors announcing herself as anything she wasn't. She didn't claim skill she couldn't prove. But when fevers came, she set cool cloths. When a woman's baby turned stubborn, she squeezed hands and whispered timing, and breathed until lungs obeyed and a cry split the world. When a widow's roof leaked, she climbed up with tar and patch and fixed the seam, because it didn't matter if a man or a woman did a job when water fell on the bed. She read to children on the church steps in the soft hour after supper, when men played checkers and the sky turned reckless. She wove Copper Creek around herself not with declaration, but with use. The town wove back. Luke Tanner watched all of this with the wary appreciation of a man who had learned not to trust anything that arrived suddenly. He came into town on Saturdays with a wagon of eggs and a list that had been Martha's once and was his now. He would find Rose wherever she was, at the school, in the store's back room, helping Mrs. Pritchard sort buttons by color, on the boarding-house steps with a book on her knees, and they'd eat sandwiches sitting on the wagon tongue, their legs swinging. Sometimes Clara sat with them, and sometimes she did not, and Luke had the sense that the difference mattered, but could not have said why if a judge gave him a week and a full jury. He liked the way she listened when Rose spoke. Not the softness of it, Copper Creek had softness enough for a small nation, but the respect. The way she looked at a child as if she were a person, and a person as if they might still be a child. He liked the way she tied a knot, clean and fast. He liked the way she looked at the ridgeline, the pause in her shoulders, as if she was counting the distance, because in her head, distances were things you could put in order. He did not like the way part of him expected something to take her away. When summer tipped toward August and the heat lay in the yards like a dog too tired to move, he found himself standing in the boarding-house hallway with his hat in both hands, scornful of himself for how quickly he had come at the sight of Rose's note. It was one word, please, written with Mrs. Parker's careful encouragement. Mrs. Perks met him at the kitchen door and pointed her rolling pin toward the back steps. "She's in the alley," she said. Clothesline let go and knocked her on her tail. "She all right?" he asked, heart rising in his throat for the wrong she'd said. "If she were dying, I'd be hollerin'. Go see." He went. Clara knelt on the packed earth near the back fence, a coil of rope at her feet, a smear of dirt on her cheekbone like finger paint. She had a cut across the heel of her hand and was trying to tie a splice with fingers that didn't want to cooperate. "You're bleeding," Luke said, moving to crouch opposite her. "It felt like the rope should have had enough," she replied, a little breathless. "But sometimes feeling and math are poor friends." He reached for her hand. She gave it without a flinch. The cut wasn't bad, but it would sting. He cleaned it with a rag he wet from the pump, then tore off a strip of his own bandana and bound it. He wasn't sure he'd breathed while he did it. When he finished, she flexed her fingers experimentally. "You're good at fixing, too," she said. "I'm good at not tying," he corrected. He turned to the line and, with a few steady motions, fed the rope through the pulley and knotted it back to itself. "There. Thank you." She stood, dusted her skirt with her good hand. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, short and bright. "Look at us. The whole town set like a broken bone and we're felled by laundry." "That makes sense," he said. "Laundry's relentless." She smiled at him, then went a shade serious. "Rose asked me yesterday what heaven smells like," she said. "I told her when I think of it, I think of warm sun on wood and coffee in the kitchen before anyone wakes, and the way dust smells when rain hits it." I asked her what she thought. "What did she say?" He couldn't conjure the child's voice out of nowhere. He hoarded it when he heard it and lived off the memory until the next time. "Papa's shirts," Clara answered. She looked at him carefully, not to see what he would do but to be there when he did it. He looked away, because if he looked at her too long, he would say something he hadn't meant to tell anyone, least of all himself. The alley seemed suddenly too narrow and his chest too tight in his brown coat. He ran a palm over his jaw to find something to do with it. "She used to help," he said without wanting to. "Martha, with the line. She got mad at knots because they were tricky and necessary, and she hated things that were both." Clara's voice softened. "I don't hate those things," she said. "I hate the way folks pretend they aren't." They stood there, a foot and a whole life between them, while the afternoon warmed and the rope held, and somewhere in the street a child who was not theirs laughed like water. "Thank you for coming," Clara said, practical again. He dipped his head. "All was will," he said, and wondered when he had decided something so absolute without consulting himself. Harvest season arrived like a choir, voices, hands, the rough music of work. The community shifted its weight to the fields, and days stitched themselves together in a new pattern. Clara rose early, helped where she could, taught afternoons under a sky that had thinned to a finer blue. She learned to handle a scythe without taking her ankle off. She learned the way wheat made a sound like applause when a wind spun through it. At dusk she stood in rows with other women and shook grain from hems and drank well water that tasted of iron and matter-of-fact miracles. In late September, 2 riders crested the ridge and poured bad out behind them like a shadow. You could tell trouble by the way dust stuck to it. They stopped at the saloon, and the younger of the 2, scar along one cheek like a punctuation mark the sentence wanted back, drank too fast and asked too many careful questions about who had money and where they kept it. Copper Creek had its share of men who wanted to pretend a fire wasn't a fire until the building was ash, but it also had Sheriff Hale. Hale told the bartender to water the whiskey and sent for Luke. Luke came. He leaned on the bar with both elbows and let the younger man talk. He made a show of being a little stupider than he was, the way you did when you wanted a man to tell you exactly what he planned to do. Out in the street, Rose waited with Clara in the shade and counted the cracks in the boardwalk to keep from counting the minutes. "He won't let anything happen," Clara told her. "It's not the happening I mind," Rose whispered, slipping her hand into Clara's without looking. "It's the almost." It turned out to be both, happening and almost. The older rider, who had a thoughtful way of keeping his shoulder against the doorframe so he never had to show you both hands at once, took a quiet measure of Copper Creek and decided maybe today wasn't the day to pull it apart. He paid for the whiskey and tipped his hat and led the younger man back to the horses. But the younger had a temper like stove kindling, and he lit fast. He said something sharp about cowards and womenfolk and Bible towns with their bank's door latch broken, and Luke laughed at exactly the wrong time to make a man like that feel small. The younger pulled his gun. Clara didn't remember stepping between the 2 of them until after she was there. She did remember the sound of Rose's breath and the way the barrel's dark circle looked very much like a buttonhole without a button, the empty kind waiting for what would go through. She heard herself say in a voice she would not have recognized as hers, "Sir, you don't want to shoot a woman where the whole town can see you." For a second the universe balanced on a coin. Then the older rider reached over and put a hand on the younger's wrist and said, in a tone of tired kindness, "Jake, we don't shoot women. We don't shoot men in front of children. We don't shoot folk at all unless they insist." He flicked a glance to the sheriff, who had moved into the street with the loose calm of a man in agony. "We're not insistin', are we?" Hale's smile didn't reach far. Not today." "Good." The older tipped his hat to Clara, an odd, precise respect that felt like both apology and compliment, and nudged his horse into motion. The younger holstered his weapon with a stiff-jawed glare, and together they rode out toward the ridge, the dust rising to erase their passing. Only after they were gone did Luke turn those river-stone eyes on Clara. "What in the—" He stopped himself neatly in deference to the ears on the street. "What made you think that was your place?" His tone was not cruel. It was frayed. Clara touched her skirt where her hands had trembled against it and found she could not stop them even now. "I didn't," she said honestly. "I only thought of Rose." He looked at his daughter. Rose looked back, a small unblinking bird with her feathers laid flat. "You doddered yourself into a rifle barrel," he said, still too loud for calm and too quiet for anger. Clara tasted metal at the back of her mouth. "If you have a better way to teach a child that love is braver than fear, I'd gladly learn it." That landed. He closed his eyes for a second, the lids as thin as paper. "Don't do it again," he said, when he opened them. "I won't," she replied, and wished she could promise it. He nodded once. The town creaked back into motion, like someone had taken their boot off its neck. That night Luke stood on his porch and watched the line of the horizon until the stars made him stop. He didn't pray exactly, but sometimes a man's silence can sound like one from far enough away. The first kiss did not come as the last note in some sweet song. It came the way some storms do, fast and without much warning, then over quickly, leaving you standing with your hair wet and your shirt sticking to your back, wondering if you both really stepped into rain together, and if so, whose idea it was. It was October. The air was full of apple and wood smoke. Clara had been at the Tanner place all afternoon, showing Rose how to cut circles out of pastry without turning them into trapezoids. They fed the scraps to the barn cat, who, being a cat, condescended to eat them only after he was sure no one was impressed. When evening leaned against the windows, Clara tied her shawl and stepped onto the porch. Luke followed her out with a basket of apples. He set it at her feet, then moved to the porch rail and took his hat off in that exact way he did when a moment needed gentling. "Stay and eat," he said, but not like a man making admission, more like a man offering a wish. "Martha used to make a stew that could carry a man 3 days, but I learned how to make it, so it carries one." She smiled. "I should go back," she said. "Mrs. Perks frets. Also, I owe her 5 cents for a spool of thread." He didn't answer for a second. Then he turned, took 2 steps, and stopped close enough that she could see the notch in his right eyebrow where some old tree branch had insisted on winning. "Clara," he said. He'd said her name before, but this time there was a space around it. "If I—" He exhaled. "I don't know what to offer you," he said simply. "There's a roof and a fire and my word. There's a child who already thinks the world of you. There's work that needs doing, and I'll do every bit you ask and the half you don't. There's grief that doesn't end, and there's joy that's too big for one person to haul. There's—" He lifted a hand like he might touch her cheek, then put it carefully down. "I want you to know I don't have a speech," he finished, helpless and honest. She could have saved him. She could have stepped in and made it easy, but it seemed wrong to steal a man's courage when he'd finally made it stand up. "I don't have one either," she said, "but I have 1,000 small sentences." She swallowed. "Like, I like how your house sounds at night, wood talking to itself, and I like that you call Rosebud even when you think you shouldn't. And my life was a letter once, and now it's a place." She lifted her face. "Also, this is me saying yes to things I don't understand yet." He kissed her. It was not the kind of kiss that would make a ballad sweat. It was careful and new, and only as complicated as 2 people who had both been lonelier than they admitted and both braver than the other knew. When it ended, they stood exactly where they had been, except now the basket of apples smelled so sharply of autumn that she could taste the season on the back of her tongue. "Stew," she whispered, because the word was easy and didn't require more proof than the world could give. "Stew," he agreed, and because it was their habit now, because the town had taught them to take the good where they found it, they went inside and ate with their sleeves rolled and their laughter quiet. And when Clara left later, she did not feel she was going away so much as going toward. They married in December. It was a small wedding because the prairie asked humility from things that hoped to last. The church was strung with greens, the boards where Luke had planed them finally lying as flat as they'd promised they would when he bought the lumber. Sheriff Hale stood with a ridiculous flower pinned to his lapel and tried not to fidget. Mrs. Perks cried into her apron and told anyone who would listen that she'd never seen a woman look so pretty on so little sleep. Mrs. Parker gave Rose the task of carrying the ring tied with a blue ribbon. Rose took the job with that grave determination that made grown men straighten their coats. Clara wore a dress that had been some other dress a year ago and was now exactly itself. Luke wore his best, which was still only good but looked better on him than better clothes had any business doing. The vows were not fancy. They were not less true for that. "Do you promise to be good to each other?" the minister asked, "and to your child?" "We do," they answered, and Rose's hand slid into Clara's on the "we" and squeezed like a promise made small so it could be carried everywhere. Afterward there was cake and cider, and folk pressed apples into their palms and then pressed their hands around their hands and used words like blessing, because sometimes the right one is the one you think you don't deserve and say anyway. David Pritchard played a fiddle that sounded better than it was. The Hollis boy danced with the Carter widow and almost smiled without knowing it. The wind came up at the corner of the church and tried the latch and found it locked against trouble for once. When they carried gifts out to the wagon, Rose tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Now you're my mama," she said, not asking, stating, as if you could set some truths down like fence posts and the prairie would reshape itself around them. Clara knelt. She had learned 1,000 things since arriving in Copper Creek. How to set a bone clean. How to teach a stubborn boy to read by letting him write about mules. How to fit herself into a town without asking it to become something else. But none of those lessons prepared her for the feeling of a child's certainty settling between her hands. Luke stood behind them, quiet as a wall that had never once fallen in a storm. She looked up at him. He nodded once. That was all the permission she needed. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I am." Rose's face broke open like day. She launched herself forward with the unstudied grace of someone who no longer has to measure the distance to safe ground and landed in Clara's arms. Luke's hand came down on both their backs, one large, steady touch covering as much as it could. The town cheered and didn't pretend it wasn't mostly for that. Marriage did not fix anything that grief had broken. It didn't have to. It brought new wood, new nails, and another set of hands steady on the hammer. The Tanner house filled with noises that had been absent too long. Small domestic miracles, the clink of cups for three, the scrape of chairs, the sight of a shawl thrown over the same hook twice because it had been taken down and used and loved and lifted again. The wind still found its way in, but someone was always there to tuck cotton in the cracks. The creek still threatened to freeze if you didn't mind it, but now there were two to break the skim and keep the water honest. Winter tested them. It always does. Snow came thick and stayed. Livestock fell ill. A coyote took a lamb in a way that made Luke curse at the door, because some losses repeat until you say them out loud. Clara learned the sound of his boots on the porch when he had been up too long. He learned the smell of her hair when she had fallen asleep reading, and the page had left a small tender mark on her cheek that said, "Here is where words touched you." Rose learned that a house with two people who loved you made a different kind of quiet when the fire went out, the kind that said someone would get up and make sure your feet didn't wake cold. On a night when the cold reached through the chinks in the wall and found your bones like an old friend, a knock came that was not neighbor or joke. Sheriff Hale stood on the porch with his hat crushed into a shape no hat ought to be. "It's Reuben Mays," he said simply. "The mine gave up something and took him back for it." Liza's labor started at the same time. Clara was putting on her coat before he finished. Luke reached for her scarf and wrapped it around her throat with fingers that were clumsy with fear. "You sure?" "I am." He nodded once. "I'll hitch." They drove through a night that had teeth. The cutter's runners sang on hard snow. Stars stared like witnesses. Liza Mays lay in her small house on Buckhorn Street and made a sound now and then that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with pushing a life out into a world that didn't always treat them kindly. Clara took her hand. Hale took the other. Luke stoked the stove until it roared and set a soft, steady stream of encouragement that embarrassed him to hear, but made the women look at him like he'd been in the right room for once. The baby came fast and red and furious, and then breathing, breathing, breathing. Liza cried with the relief of someone who could now afford to. Hale sat back on his heels and praised God in a voice that remembered how. Luke leaned against the wall and pressed his palms over his eyes, because sometimes you have to hold the inside of your head together when something important snaps back into place. When the little boy's cry softened to the polishing sound that meant he was going to stay, Clara looked at Luke, and the look said, "This is the work of the rest of our days, in all the ways it comes." He gave it back to her without blinking. The morning after, the town woke to a blue so cold you could hear it. At the Tanner place, Clara stood at the window with a cup of coffee and watched Rose show the barn cat how to step exactly in her footprints so his paws wouldn't go deeper than hers. Luke came up behind her and set his chin on her shoulder. They stood like that for a while, lovers and parents and workers, people who had made a small shelter in a place that asked for proof of everything. "You still wish you were somewhere else?" he asked. "No," she said simply. "I didn't know the difference between lonely and alone until I wasn't lonely anymore." He turned her gently and kissed the corner of her mouth. "You smell like soap and a book," he murmured. She laughed, startled, remembering the first thing Rose had told her. "Do I?" "Most days," he said. "Sometimes stew." The years began to take on shape then. Not soft, not easy, but good. Spring returned because it always does, then left because it must, and they rode the long seesaw of seasons with growing ease. The schoolhouse grew an addition. Clara's reading circle filled the church steps in summer like sparrows. Rose built a collection of buttons that could tell the story of every dress in town. Troubles came. They always do. The younger rider returned alone one hot afternoon with a worse scar and a better gun, and a look in his eyes like a man arguing with his shadow. He tried the door to the bank and found it stronger now, the hinges sunk deeper, and Sheriff Hale's rifle steadier than last winter. He left without firing. The town watched him go and counted the lesson as victory, no shots, all courage. The dead did not stop being dead. Martha lived in the house the way lots of dead do, quietly, insistently, kindly, in the shape of a teacup's handle and a patch on a quilt, and the habit Rose had of putting the salt next to the stove because that's where her mother had found it one December when everything tasted wrong. If there was ever jealousy in the way past and present sat at the Tanner table, it was the kind that ashamed itself quickly and left behind only gratitude that a house had so many stories in its walls. One summer the creek jumped its banks and tried to move the road half a mile northeast out of spite. Luke and Clara stood shin-deep in muddy water and laughed at the absurdity of it while they hauled rocks like two mules in love. In autumn, a peddler passed through with a box of music that you wound with a key, and Rose saved for 6 weeks to buy it, and then fell asleep on a Wednesday listening to it play a song that pretended to be small and wasn't. In winter the wind wrote its name on the windows in breath, and they traced it with their fingers and read it backwards. On the day Clara stood in the schoolhouse for the first time as the town's recognized teacher, Mrs. Parker having decided she preferred bossing the grown-ups and handing Clara the chalk, the children lined up with tidy chaos, and Rose slipped a piece of paper onto Clara's desk. It read, in letters that were steady and round, "Can you be my mommy?" Below it, someone had written a second line in careful adult hand, "Thank you for saying yes." Luke leaned in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and their eyes met, and the map of everything they had done and would do lay between them, all roads leading home. Some nights, when the house settled with that particular sound that meant cold and contentment had struck a truce, Clara would wake to find Rose standing in the doorway, hair a cloud around her head. "Bad dream?" Clara would whisper. Rose would nod, and Luke would lift the blanket without a word, and the small body would fit between them like a piece finally found after months of looking. In the morning, there would be a warm hollow where that small body had been, and it would smell like soap and wood smoke and a little like apples even in spring. Years later, when Rose was tall and soft-spoken and wrote stories in a ledger she kept beneath her mattress, a little girl with dark plaits came to Copper Creek on a stage and stepped down from the coach with a look in her eyes like a person listening for a sound they've not heard yet, but desperately hope exists. Rose watched the way the town leaned toward the child, the way Sheriff Hale reached out a hand that had steadied 100 falls, the way Mrs. Perks said, "Come in," as if it were a magic spell. She felt a touch on her sleeve and looked up to see her mother beside her, and the smell of soap and book and stew wrapped around them both. "Do you remember?" Clara asked quietly. "I do," Rose said. "I remember the almost, and I remember the yes. And if this story had to end somewhere, and all good ones do if you want to be able to carry them, let it end here, a man and a woman and a child, and then a larger circle, and then a town, making the kind of home that can hold a small voice asking the bravest question it knows, and answering, not with speeches or trumpets or easy miracles, but with work and listening, and the decision, freshly made every morning, to say yes again." The thaw of spring turned to the blaze of summer, and Copper Creek settled into its own rhythm of work, gossip, and whispered prayers. Clara found herself folded deeper into Luke Tanner's household, though no one ever said aloud what name to give the bond forming there. Rose continued to hold Clara's hand with fierce certainty, as if the act alone might keep the woman anchored in town, while Luke wrestled silently with a heart that was both grateful and terrified of what he could lose again. Each day Clara rose before dawn, brushing her hair in the dim light while the boarding house slept. She helped Rose braid hers before school, sometimes packing a biscuit or a slice of cheese for the child's midday meal. She found small, unexpected joys in teaching, showing the little ones letters, watching older boys discover the proud sound of their own voices when they read aloud, coaxing shy girls into answering sums. In the evenings, she walked back through the street alive with horses, lanterns, and the smell of frying onions, often stopping at the Tanner Ranch to bring Rose home when Luke had been called away too long. But happiness on the frontier was a fragile thing, and trouble, as always, arrived by horseback. It began with cattle. Several head from Luke's herd were found slaughtered near the ridge, necks cut, hides stripped, the mark of rustlers, bold enough to work close to a settled ranch. Luke rode the perimeter with Hale, jaw set like stone. Clara saw the tension in his shoulders when he came in at dusk, dust clinging to his boots, and she knew the man carried more than fear for livestock. A widow's ranch a mile south had lost 3 steers the same week, and rumors swirled that a small band of drifters was testing the valley's defenses. Clara wanted to ask if he feared for Rose. She wanted to tell him she feared for him. But Luke's silence was a careful armor, and she learned that sometimes the strongest love was keeping watch beside someone who would not name what haunted him. Then, one evening in July, the danger came knocking plain as day. Rose had been playing with a rag doll on the porch when two riders approached, their horses kicking up dust. They stopped at the gate, hats low, guns visible. Clara stepped instinctively in front of the child. "We're looking for Tanner," one said, voice rough as gravel. "He owes us a word." Luke came through the door behind her, calm but taut. "You got your word when you cut my fence," he said. "Next time, you won't like what comes after." The rider sneered. Mighty bold for a man alone. Clara's hand closed around Rose's small fingers. Luke's gaze flicked briefly to hers, steady and unreadable, before returning to the men. "I'm not alone," he said, voice low. Something in that answer shifted the air between them. The riders spat in the dirt and rode off with muttered threats. But Clara's heart hammered long after the dust had settled. She realized then that Luke had spoken not just of Hale or the other ranchers who would come, if called, but of her, of Rose, of the fragile family they were building. That night, after Rose had fallen asleep curled around her doll, Clara stepped onto the porch where Luke stood staring out at the hills. The moon lit his profile, sharp and weary. "You can't face this alone," she said softly. He didn't turn. "Don't intend to. But a man's life can turn quick out here. I won't drag you into something that could break you." She stepped closer until her shoulder brushed his. "I was broken long before Copper Creek. It was a child's voice that put me back together." His hand twitched at his side. For a moment he seemed about to reach for her. Instead, he exhaled, the sound torn from deep inside. "You deserve peace, Clara. I don't know if I can give you that." "You've already given me more than peace," she answered. "You've given me a place." At last he looked at her, eyes raw with a truth he could no longer bury. "And you've given me back my little girl." The words hung between them, heavier than any vow. Neither moved, but in the stillness something bound them tighter than steel. The confrontation with the rustlers came weeks later, sudden and violent. Sheriff Hale gathered a posse when smoke was sighted near the ridge. Luke saddled his horse with grim efficiency, and Clara found herself gripping his arm before he mounted. "Come back," she whispered. His hand covered hers briefly, strong and warm. "I'll try," he said simply, and rode out. The hours stretched endless. Clara sat with Rose, who clutched her doll but did not cry. When the sound of hooves finally returned in the dark, Clara rushed to the gate. Luke rode in weary but whole, a shallow cut at his temple and dust streaking his shirt. Hale followed, leading two bound men between horses. "It's done," Luke said, swinging down stiffly. Clara pressed a cloth to his wound despite his muttered protests. Her hands trembled, not from fear anymore, but from the sharp relief of knowing he had kept his promise. Rose crawled into his arms, tucking her face into his shoulder. "I dreamed you'd be gone," she whispered. "Not while I've got you, Bug," he murmured. His eyes lifted to Clara's over the child's head, and for the first time there was no wall between them. By autumn, Copper Creek whispered less about the Boston woman who came on a stage and more about the Tanner household that seemed whole again. Clara had not planned to love a widower, nor to mother a child who was not hers by blood. But love, she discovered, was rarely planned. It was chosen, sometimes quietly, sometimes desperately, always with the risk of breaking. One crisp October morning, Luke found her hanging laundry behind the house, sunlight catching in her hair. He watched a moment, then said gruffly, "This house hasn't felt like home since Martha died." "Not until now." Clara stilled, the sheet billowing between them. "I can't promise a life without storms," he went on, "but I can promise to stand through them, with you, if you'll have me." Her breath caught. The sheet dropped, revealing her tears and her smile. "Yes, Luke Tanner," she whispered. "Yes." Rose, peeking from the porch, squealed with delight and darted down the steps. "Does this mean forever?" she asked breathlessly. Luke crouched, pulling her close. "Forever," he said, voice thick. "If she'll be your mama." Clara knelt, cupping Rose's face. "I already am," she said. The child's answering laugh was the sound of a heart mended. Their wedding was held in the small church, simple as the prairie itself. Friends filled the pews, Hale stood as witness, and Rose scattered dried wildflowers down the aisle with solemn joy. Clara wore a gown stitched from fabric gifted by the town's women, and Luke's hands shook as he took hers. When they spoke their vows, they did not promise perfection, only presence. To rise together, to work together, to raise the child who had brought them both back to life. As the congregation sang, Rose slipped her hand into Clara's. "See," she whispered, "I told you." "Told me what, darling?" Clara asked. "That you were meant to be my mommy." Clara's eyes blurred. She squeezed the child's hand, then Luke's. And in that moment, with the scent of prairie sage drifting through the windows and the sound of voices rising around them, she knew she had been right to come west, not to marry Elijah Carter, as she once thought, but to find the family who had been waiting for her all along. And Copper Creek, in its rugged, unyielding way, knew it too.